Can you tell I'm just making these up on the spot? Anyways, my name is Cinnamon Roll, and I'm turning my school bus into a home. Last week I built this housing for the heater blower, and this week I'm finalizing the design. The first thing I needed to do was to build an access door. This was pretty simple. I just measured out a piece of metal and cut it to size. I then took off all the sharp edges with the flap disc sanding wheel. I figured out where I wanted it to sit and then welded in these hinges. Once I'd cleaned up the welds with the grinder, I had to figure out how to make this panel stay in place. I tried all sorts of ideas for latching mechanisms, but I eventually settled on this friction style latch. Once I had that welded in, I did a quick test fit to see how everything would go together, and I realized that I'd miscalculated a bit and the plastic piece didn't line up with my heater housing. So I bent up another piece of metal that would redirect air into the plastic piece. I added a few more screws into the housing just to solidify its position, and then I screwed the new piece into place. I was pretty happy with the overall layout, so I took everything apart again and gave it a quick coat of primer. I then took the plastic piece and cut out the air hole. There were probably better ways to do this, but the jigsaw made quick work of it, and it was good enough for the girls I go out with. Huh, where'd that come from? Anyways, there was another hole in this plastic piece that needed to be covered up, so I took some of the scrap plastic and cut a patch that I will fasten over the hole later. Then I went around with a utility knife and deburred my cuts. I did one final test fit to make sure everything works the way I wanted it to. And then I took it all apart again. Look, when you're fabricating custom parts, this is just how it goes. I noticed that the underdash support was looking a little rusty and dirty, so I took a metal brush to it to clean it up a little and then vacuumed it off. I then sprayed the last of my rust converter onto the rusty spots to prevent any more rust from building up. I then went back to the blower housing and used seam sealer to fill in all the gaps left from welding. While I waited for the seam sealer to dry, I turned my attention to other projects. The driver's window originally had these plastic clips that held the windows closed while driving, but because of the way I modified this window, they wouldn't work with my setup, so I had to build new ones. So I found a strip of metal and I started bending it up. I won't go into detail about how I did this because there's really not a lot to it. Bend metal, check fitment, bend some more, recheck, etc, etc. And then when I was happy, I primed them and then screwed them into place. As I finished that project up, it was beginning to rain, so it was the perfect time to identify where the puddles of water on the floors were originating from. I started by grabbing some seam sealer and began filling any gaps or holes that could possibly allow water ingress. I wasn't too concerned about how these seams looked because they're going to be covered up anyways. All I'm trying to do here is to just stop any more leaks from happening. It was here where I discovered where the main source of this particular leak was, and I needed to remove this extra piece of metal to access it, so I grabbed the grinder and cut it off. I sealed around where the leak was coming in, and I'm happy to say that fixed that particular issue. I then went around and emptied the tube of seam sealer on whatever I thought looked like it needed sealing. I also drilled some extra drain holes to prevent water from pooling in behind the walls. Now I had one last thing that I wanted to do for this video, and that was to find the center line of the bus. Why is this important? Well, I'm planning to put strapping up, and I want it to be evenly spaced and straight so that it's easy to screw into. Finding the center line of the bus will help with this. The way I did this was to measure up from the floor, and I marked a position at the same heights on both sides of the bus. From these marks, I measured up at an angle to the roof of the bus and marked the same measurement from both lines. The center of the two lines I marked on the roof would then be my center line. I did the same at the front of the bus and used a self-drilling screw to hold one end of the chalk line in place, and then used the lines at the back to snap my chalk line down the center of the bus. Now the chalk lines were pretty faint, so I went back over them with a paint marker to make sure that they wouldn't fade away. And that's all for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, I'd be very grateful if you'd consider subscribing. It's by no means necessary, but it does help this channel grow. I'd also like to invite you to like and comment. Engagement is how these videos get out to the masses, and there's also the boost video option if you feel so inclined. Anyways, have yourself a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.